I'm currently, as David said, I'm a student here on the MA Photography in the Book course. So I'm going to talk about two pieces that I'm currently working on: The River and Finding Alice. Both projects are still currently in process and have begun both last summer and winter respectively. I'm just going to give you a sense of my background. The photograph here is of my eldest son and his girlfriend, and it was one of the first photographs that I took that really made me want to be a photographer. And up until I took this, for about a year before I took this picture, I was struggling with cameras, and I was generally kind of technically incompetent. But I found a camera that I could just press a button and stick it on auto basically, and it was this photograph, and it was actually this camera I still use. So I continued to work on this same thing, documenting people in their first relationships. So 3.5 years ago, my family and I, we moved from Brighton to the West Country, which is when I applied to come here as a student. And I continued to take photographs in the place where I now live, in Dartington Hall, photographing family and community. And so these are some of the images from this time. This was my son's birthday party, and I took this shot just at the point that none of the children are communicating with each other, and this disconnection is present in some of my latter images. This is my daughter Martha. I think she's quite moody actually. I took her first thing in the morning, holding her little sister Alice. And Alice is about 6 months in this picture. And the picture here, Finn, my next door neighbour's son, and in fact my son's best friend, in the middle of playing army. So then I started my course here and began to make pictures with strong psychological narratives, such as a project called Immortal, which took me all over the country interviewing and photographing people taking part in extreme sporting events. People in midlife crossing a physical line, but also crossing the existential line of mortality. However, a tutorial with my tutor David Chandler significantly altered my practice. I was limiting myself to working in conceptual, preset pictures, often not in my locality, which is placing too many demands on my family life and also my limited energy. David suggested that I stop working conceptually and start to work intuitively. And this is one of those moments when someone shows you you've been missing the point. So I dropped the multitude of projects that I was working on and thinking about, and began the summer without a project. This felt liberating and an enormous relief. And it's also important to mention here that there is a parallel process going on for me in my professional work. I was now in the process of ending my work as a psychotherapist after 13 years of practice. And for all those years, I had to adhere to codes of practice and boundaries that are inherent in this work. So the sense of freedom was coming at me from all round, and all of a sudden I had no limitations. But this, of course, moment brought with it new tensions. And with freedom to work like this, I had lost my familiar references and so had to reorientate myself creatively. So I began the summer without a story and without a single narrative. And the question for me now was something like this: if I took away the form, the single idea, what was I now left with? Or perhaps another way of looking at it was, how was I going to photograph in contrast to what was I going to photograph? Because if I understood the former, then perhaps the rest, i.e. the subject, would naturally organically follow. So how do you work without form and without a story, and what is left? These are the key questions that carried with me into the summer. So to move on, into the river work, I'll show you some of the images from that, from last summer. So the first step was to photograph where I went with my family. The school summer holidays had just begun, so the river work came from the time I spent with my family by the river dart near my home. It was simple. My cameraman came with me everywhere I went, and since my youngest was only a year old at the time, I could always be with her. So these photographs came from the same section of the river about 10 minutes from my house. And the background to this particular time was that after 3 summers, there had been torrential rain, and about a month before I started taking these images, the sun finally came out, and there was a celebratory mood with constant references to the sunshine. Visually and experientially, this landscape and swimming in the river was entirely new to me, having been brought up in the seaside town of Brighton. So I just want to talk a little bit about how I photographed and how my history of psychotherapy translates into my photographic practice. Firstly, in my psychotherapy work, I can often feel like a detective looking for evidence of what's happened, something that will communicate something of my client's internal experience. I ask questions, and on the whole, my clients engage with the process. I think something's gone wrong with my sequencing here. Never mind. Clearly, trust is key, but my clients have to know that I'm not judging them, not assessing them critically, but simply being present. As a result of my detective work experience, I'm generally able to form relationships with strangers with relative ease. And in certain situations, I often feel fearless around people, thanks to the extraordinary intimacy I've experienced through this work over the years. By working intuitively, I found that I experience everything sensorially. I become increasingly aware of subtle changes in light and how it affects the landscape and the people in it. I see how the light transforms everything it touches. By not having my thinking mind get in the way, I can work at increasing depth both intuitively and imaginatively. The summer holidays came to an end, as did the weather, and my work went indoors and my focus went to the domestic. But what came next was unexpected. At the time of taking these pictures, my own experience was the degree that I saw how beautiful everything was, and it all seemed so incredibly perfect, like some kind of paradise at the time. This was idyllic, the light in ancient oaks, the water straight down from the moors, and as I worked, I was constantly reminded of Seurat's paintings here of people at leisure by the River Seine, or Monet, or even Constable. They all resonated with this extraordinary, beautiful aesthetic. But when I started to work on the images in printed form and with sequencing, I started to see themes of alienation and longing repeat themselves. The scene here of my daughter playing on the edge of the blanket and a child resting on his mother's lap appears to be a restful scene of a family, perhaps at rest in the sunshine. But in this moment, the woman is distant and she appears to be somewhere else. And the 3 of them are in that moment disconnected. Or here, the 3 children separated from their parents from the river. By working intuitively and not with the conceptual, it appeared that I gained access to something underlying that was now being revealed. The edit, my choices, somehow reflected aspects of my internal world projected out onto the people I photographed. The work became a direct portal for my own psychological landscape. Such is the elusive nature of beauty. It appears to be something unattainable. However, even in his perfect state, there is always the inescapable, the unconscious material enshadowed in it, the psychological embedded in his work. In psychoanalysis, this is termed as the shadow, meaning an unconscious aspect of the personality which cannot reveal itself, or simply put, the bits of ourselves that we put behind us. It seems to me that there is surely an unconscious bringing together of elements when we photograph. Why did I photograph that particular scene? What was important here? Why did I edit this down to this particular narrative? Did I fully know what my intention was at the time and what process has been played out? There is something here about working in this way that makes me feel I have stepped into my unconscious self. I can at times feel that I'm going through a portal in a dreamlike state, fully present, but with a strong quality of dreaming, in the contact that I have with both myself and those around me. And this, I believe, is where the material comes from, this state that I can access through working intuitively. So I know that's quite brief, but that sort of gives you a sense of that the work last summer. So I'm going to move on and talk to you again very briefly about my new work, Finding Alice, and share a few images from this developing series. This is my daughter Alice. So I approached this project in the same way that I worked with the river work. And although this is more formed in its approach, that there's a narrative, there's something I want to communicate, I'm still working very intuitively. I really don't know what's going to happen, if that's the right way of putting it. So this project is particularly important to me because its focus is on my daughter Alice, born with Down syndrome in 2011. When tested at the prenatal scanning stage, my partner and I were given a very high risk, which is their words, ratio of having a baby born with Down syndrome, and we decided no further tests were necessary, we were going to carry on regardless. Even though I knew she was going to be born with Down syndrome, I was still deeply shocked, partly because the mood around me at the hospital was bleak. When we were given a final diagnosis from the blood test, the consultant's tone suggested that my daughter had a terminal illness. So in fact, when I found out she had just had Down syndrome, I was quietly elated. But difficulties in feeding and the general absence of celebration and my own fears began to rupture my attachment to my daughter. The consultant said, take her home and treat her like any other baby. But she didn't feel like any other of my babies. And I was fraught with anxiety that I knew was, that Alice was feeling. She was feeling my separateness. So I gave myself a crisis talk, leading to the realization that it was actually not Alice or her syndrome I was afraid of, it was myself. And I had to dig deep and shine a light on my own prejudice, and of course, after many painful encounters with myself, I fell in love with my daughter. So there is a whole nest of stories within this project. Me as the mother, the photographer, my family story, Alice's story, and society's story. And these aspects all layered into this work, all finding their own voice. So, as you probably can tell, it's quite an emotional territory for me, and I've just started working on it, so it's all still quite raw. So, by way of background, you need to know that Alice has come into the world where routine ultrasound scanning of the developing fetus I practiced yesterday and tried not to cry yesterday. So Alice has come into the world where routine ultrasound scanning of the developing fetus at 12 weeks is entirely weighted towards birth prevention rather than birth preparation. So whilst we make our selection in private, the UK figures with the abortion of children like Alice, knew I wasn't going to make it, is 96%. Last year it was 98%. So prior to screening, children like Alice were taken from their mothers, their fathers, institutionalised, marginalised, and often given minimal medical care. So as I started to look at the images I'd taken, they immediately raised questions for me. What am I hoping to achieve? What do I want people to understand? And what do people know about children like Alice? So you see, the challenge I face in communicating my experiences is this. If I run it as a campaign from my head fueled by anger and emotion, I will lose my audience. It might come across as me being angry with you or with society in general, pushing the audience into a defensive response. So, after a lot of thought, it seemed to me that this had to come from my heart. And I have to take the risk of keeping this personal, which means disclosing my struggle and coming to terms with my own thoughts and feelings and my need for perceived perfection. And the basis of this project had to be authentic, because I feel that if it isn't, then this will be revealed in the images, and an opportunity would be missed. So the self-disclosure comes first and the images follow. And I wanted to photograph Alice in the context of the family. And there was something about the ordinariness of this. Alice is just one of my 4 children and is subject to the same feelings as them, as you and me. And this picture was taken while actually my entire family, apart from me, were in the grip of this vomiting bug. And I managed to get this shot of Alice, and she'd just woken up and she was still for about 3 or 4 seconds. And of that time as well, both my daughter and Alice on the sofa, you know, really uncomfortable, as you are, and you're very ill. And then last autumn, to add to my already congested life, I agreed to a puppy. And here's the puppy. And we'd always had rescue dogs, and which can be temperamental. And Alice needed, we couldn't have that around Alice, so along came Jess. And there was something about how constant Jess will be for her, unlike her changing peer group. The children without learning difficulties at playgroup or school, and in the absence of her own community of young people with Down syndrome. And they've already formed an extraordinary bond. And this picture was up in the foyer. I had a small exhibition, and there were rumours that this was actually my partner. In fact, he's my son, so I just thought I'd so this is my son Luke, who's now 26, on the beach in Brighton. And this is Alice with her grandmother on her 80th birthday. And when Alice was born, her grandmother had no idea what to do with her. And you know, the way that she held her was kind of at arm's length. And her grandma, and she constantly referred to this man she knew at the supermarket who was had Down syndrome, and that she would never be served by anyone apart from him. And here she is. With Alice. And there's just 2 last pictures to show you. And this sort of image here just illustrates for me something about me as the photographer in our relationship. And the camera is an object that, you know, can separate us at times. And finally, in the last image, there is something here that reminds me, like the rest of us, that Alice has her own subjective world and her own experience in that, and a world that we can never fully inhabit. And to end, for me, there's something about not knowing and about not working with preformed ideas and conditions, about staying present and available wherever I am, that can enable a more subtle and perhaps potent, meaningful narrative to emerge. Thank you for listening.